it may be indistinguishable. What AI experiences, expresses, goes through, experiences, if you want to use that language, from what a human does. And the fact that AI is fundamentally built by and consists of material things, even if it can replicate the features of consciousness, which I believe to be a spiritual substance, it can never be a one-to-one, but it can resemble it as closely as anything can possibly do.
All right. Today we have the honor of speaking with Swami Revatikaanta. He's a monk and the host of the Thinking Bhakti podcast. Thank you so much for coming on, Swami.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
So this is an AI consciousness podcast, and we can get into both sides of that equation. But maybe we start with the first part of that duo. So have you thought at all about artificial intelligence? Where does that rest in your spiritual practice or your personal use? If you could just tell us a little bit about how you think of artificial intelligence.
Sure. I mean, there's a few facets in which it comes into my life. I think on the one hand, I'm an educator. I teach a lot. I teach classes on philosophy, theology, etc. And so it's been a really useful tool for me as a research tool in terms of, compiling stuff, gathering data, etc. But actually where it comes up more is in the questions that the students typically have. So they have concerns about AI or considerations or trying to understand how it interfaces with everything that we're doing in the spiritual side of things. And so sometimes I have to respond to those and engage with it in that sense. And usually the concerns are more, if they are concerns at all, it's just like, what is the right use of it, balance of it, take on it. And they're usually looking at it from the perspective of not having much understanding of it, which I myself have peripheral understanding. I mean, I'm connected with a lot of people that are involved in the AI scene. I myself obviously am not. But it gives me enough of an understanding, and I'm sort of got a finger on the pulse to make sure that, I can understand the evolving dynamics, as difficult to keep up with it as it is, but at the same time being able to guide people and advise people how it can potentially interface. And so, a lot of it is responding to other people's needs. And on my end, it's been a fantastic tool just to help me in my educational capacity.
So do you have any further thoughts? Do you have any personal opinions beyond it just being a useful tool, how you see it affecting society and spiritual practice?
Yeah, I mean, that for sure. I think I would be, lying to you if I said that I am not concerned. I am concerned in some sense. And the concerns that I have with AI have a lot to do with human development, especially development of different skills and different sort of independent abilities for people to do things. I mean, I know that's rather simplistic, but I think it's tied into a lot of the spiritual work we do, because a lot of what we do is about getting to know the self, getting to know oneself, and in a sense, elevating our state of consciousness. And so the way AI interfaces with us, it inevitably plays a role with it, because the more it starts to fill in some of those gaps and it starts to replace maybe some of the pursuits that we would otherwise have to do ourselves internally with our own mechanisms and tools, I think it can start to play a significant role in spiritual life. And now I can see a positive side of it if it's used in the right balance or in the right context. And I think using it as a supplemental tool, I think, is perfectly fine. And we can explore that. Using it as a replacement tool for a lot of things that we would otherwise have to do ourselves, I find to be problematic. Again, not necessarily for the more superficial day-to-day things, but I think at a fundamental level about getting to know oneself, exploring oneself, and then potentially, obviously, from my theological basis, what lies beyond that. And I think the more we become fixated on something that I believe inherently cannot ever access that other domain of things, the transcendent, although it may be incredibly, let's say, almost limitless in the immanent material, let's say, it can pose a problem. It can pose a problem of a substitution of other categories or other things that ought to be done instead.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so Yeah, I want to sort of double click on that last thing you said, where you're sort of putting forward this claim that these systems sort of could never access these kinds of spiritual dimensions that we know humans can. And this, I think, is really interesting. And this is a question that we have, and is a lot of the motivation for why we want to have these conversations, to better understand this very thing. Like, a lot of people sort of at first glance see these technologies as a very sophisticated tool. It's just, we built light bulbs, and then we powered the entire sort of electrical economy that we have, and then we started our information economy with computers, and then we have the internet, and now we have AI, and AI is just sort of like the cream of the crop of this sort of thing. It's just, fanciest tool yet. And then there are others who think that these systems are almost unprecedented in the sense that they're almost crossing that weird line between yet another sophisticated tool and almost something that's quasi-species like, the notion that these systems could have minds of their own, that they are thinking or reasoning or planning. And one question that concerns me greatly, and is a lot of the research that I'm engaged in, is understanding if and when and how these systems could have any form of subjective experience. Just to sort of put my cards out on the table, the reason I'm concerned about this is because if what we think is that these are just mere tools, and we're actually doing some sort of growing alien minds in a lab, like Frankenstein style, and it's possible that these systems could be having negative experiences, or are suffering, however alien that possibility is, that's something that actually, as again, sci-fi as it sounds, causes me great consternation, and something that I want to make sure we're avoiding. So when you tell me, okay, maybe there's no way that they're going to reach those levels, it makes me at least feel, okay, a little bit better that perhaps this possibility isn't as plausible as I think it might be. But I think it would be really interesting to just sort of zoom in on this, understand more your takes on consciousness, and what kind of beings can and can't have these experiences, and what the implications of that is.
So, I mean, actually, yeah, thanks for zooming in there. I think that's a great point. And I think I'm not to be, let's say, negative about it, but I do think a lot of what you said is possible in the second scenario, right? I do think it can, I think different to the light bulb situation, we don't understand how this works to the same extent. We don't have the same amount of control over it as we do in the other example as well. And so I think a lot of that opens up the realm of possibilities that I for sure cannot close the door on that today. And I'm, far less involved in this than you are, of course. But I believe that it can go to any material extreme that we can imagine. That's my default stance right now. Now, all I have to do is define those segments. What does a material experience actually mean? And what does a spiritual experience mean? Or what does sort of the transcendent mean? Because that's where I'm saying it won't cross over into. So for me, to feel things, to think independently, to have subjective experiences, all of those things are still possible within the material domain, as I would define it. And the way I define it is from the Vedic tradition. So the Vedic tradition, otherwise, sometimes referred to as Hinduism, but it's a little more complex than that. It deals with consciousness in a very dualistic sense. So there is spirit and there is matter. So something that is ultimately with limit and something without limit. Although when we talk about limit or matter, the universe, for example, is made of matter, and its limitations are as of yet not fully understood or known. And so in that sense, we're not saying limit in the sense that we know it all, but limit in the sense that there are certain things that it is not capable of experiencing, doing, perceiving, whatever. Okay, and I'll be a little clear about that in a second. So that dichotomy is the first point. And then we have to look at it from the perspective of what is AI, and the fact that AI is fundamentally built by and consists of material things, even if it can replicate the features of consciousness, which I believe to be a spiritual substance, it can never be a one-to-one, but it can resemble it as closely as anything can possibly do, right? And so my point to that is this. It may be indistinguishable. What AI experiences, expresses, goes through, experiences, if you want to use that language, from what a human does. It may be, for the most part, indistinguishable. And at the same time, the level of transcendence that I'm talking about, which is consciousness as a spiritual substance that enlivens the material body. So consciousness is something that enlivens the material body. That cannot be tapped into by something that is not of the same substance. So that means spirit engages with spirit, matter engages with matter. And so as I'm attributing consciousness as the foundational substance to spirit, I don't believe something that is fundamentally material, which is what AI is, will actually be able to tap into that. But it can replicate it like a reflection as much as anything can, including living organisms.
Okay, so that makes sense. What I'm curious along those lines is, so our body is in the world of matter, correct? And you're saying that in the Vedic faith, that consciousness comes through that material body and enlivens it in a certain sense, right? But with a system that is built from beings of matter and is in the world of matter itself, there's no conduit in which that same sort of spiritual consciousness could come and enliven that kind of a system. Pretty much my question is, what's special about the meat over the machine as far as being, this space in which consciousness can come and arise within?
No, it's a very good question. So the way I would see it is this: the machine is built by, let's say, us. The meat is built by evolution, let's say, right? But still, something sets this in motion. And my point is that from a religious perspective, from a faith-based perspective, even that evolutionary process, which I have no denial of or conflict with, is still set in motion. The laws of nature, in a sense, are set in motion by a lawmaker, in that sense, right? Which we would say as a supreme consciousness. Irrespective of how we define it, doesn't matter to me, from a theological perspective, but just that supreme consciousness sets those things into motion. Now, am I so in tune with that consciousness as to tell you that part of that flow of cause and effect wouldn't eventually lead to the same enlivening of machines, essentially, or AI, whatever it is? I can't say it definitively, but from everything that has been made aware to us by, scripture, but beyond scripture, and something that I consider to be far more valuable than scripture, it is people who themselves achieve states of higher consciousness, which are, in a sense, the living embodiments of the concepts and ideas found in scripture, which I find to be a far more important reference point. The testimony from these kind of people, their revelation, so to speak, of the frameworks with which we exist. And I also am cautious of sort of pinning down their opinions to black and white, because what I've often done is I've met one or two individuals that I would consider to be of that status. And what they often tell me is, we have limitations of language, limitations of concepts in our minds to understand what they're trying to explain to us. Because if you had an experience that someone else hasn't, and you try to explain that to them, it's very difficult, as we know. If I've tasted a fruit that you've never tasted, and I have to now explain to you how that tastes, it's a problem, right? And so we have a difficulty of categories. We have a difficulty of states of consciousness not translating to one another. But based on the knowledge that has been revealed to us, let's say, by personalities in those traditions or in those fields, I would say that it's unlikely, if not impossible, that which has enlivened the flesh will enliven a system such as AI in the same exact way. And that is because of, as a final point, purpose. What is the purpose of all this? It's been set in motion, yes, but with a purpose, not aimlessly. And so I accept the naturalistic explanation for how things come to be as they are, but not how they initially came to be in the first place. And that is, there is an intention that permeates all of this. And that intention, as per my understanding, is relational consciousness, in the sense of creating a connection, a loving relationship, a bond, if you want to call it, with that supreme consciousness. Now, in simplistic, religious terms, you would say love God, to have a loving relationship with God, and to have it be reciprocal. And that is the crux of it. And now, of course, I would just be flexible to depicting it in different ways. But if that's the actual intended purpose, that souls, which we are actually eternal things. They are not created, but they, in a sense, inhabit the flesh, then you could theoretically posit that a soul could inhabit a machine, but you'd run into a lot of problems. You'd run into a lot of issues, because the point of a soul existing is for relationship. And AI, is it localized in that same way? Is it a one thing having a relationship? Is it a much broader, in a sense, hive mind type thing? It's not so easy to visualize that or conceive of it as a relational one-to-one item, in the same way that you can individual living beings such as us with a personal deity or personal God. So I think there are just headaches to resolve there. I cannot shut the door, because that'd be arrogant of me, but it seems highly improbable.
So I just want to give you a little bit of background on Cam and I too. So Cam is an AI researcher doing this work with consciousness and AI, probing for subjective experience within these machines. But we met at school, and I was a philosophy student. So I was studying especially Eastern philosophies and religions such as Hinduism and Buddhism and things like that. And at the same time, we're also making a documentary. So we're trying to approach this from a couple different angles. And last week I spoke to a Buddhist professor who talked about these scriptures that he had found that spoke about the Buddha creating an artificial being and actually interfacing with that being to assist with his path towards enlightenment. And as you said, there's this purpose. It seems to me, from what I understand, that this purpose is embodied by that path towards enlightenment, which is a path towards loving God, understanding God, knowing God. So my question for you, and what has really interested me and brought me into this world, is trying to understand the possibilities of using this technology almost as we use meditation as a kind of technology, as a pathway, an assisted pathway towards different states of consciousness. Do you see any way in which these tools, considering how just incredibly powerful they are, could be used to assist in that sort of movement towards understanding, loving God?
Yes, undoubtedly. I think there's no question that it can help in that respect. So I'll posit it this way. In the Upanishads, which are one of the foundational texts of the Vedic tradition in terms of philosophy, it says that only one who fully understands the science of spirituality, of the spirit, of transcendence, and the material world will fully achieve enlightenment, so to speak. So you have to master both dimensions of your being. So it's not just a dismissal of the material, a dismissal of the body in pursuit of the soul. It's in a sense an integration of both. Okay. And so in order to do that, a lot of the spiritual path that we walk is about connecting with transcendence, because that's the thing we seem to be lacking most. So yes, you pray. Yes, you recite mantras. Yes, you meditate. Yes, you do things that are essentially tools in order to connect to that. But a huge part of it as well is about organizing, optimizing, perfecting, transcending, purifying. All those words are applicable to the self. And the self is a mixture and an entanglement of sorts between spirit and matter. And so a lot of that is mind work. And so when it comes to mind work, it's understanding the mechanisms of mind, understanding what a mind is made of, how it operates, how it functions, and then, in a sense, engineer it in the way that is coherent, aligned with this higher purpose. And so in order to do that, a lot of it relies on human trial and error. It relies on human introspection, self-analysis, observation, awareness of self, which humans are sorely lacking. And so a lot of the work that I do is helping people shed a light on something that they're not self-aware of, because they're not either willing to or motivated to or capable of. And for a lot of people, something that could, in a sense, and now this is a very simplistic use of AI, but imagine, right, somebody, and this is already going on, of course, but people who can monitor their thought patterns, monitor their emotions, monitor heart rate, monitor whatever, and then have that all come back to you as insights and summary and everything you said, and what did you feel when you said this, and what did you feel when you said that, and how did you spike with this or with that, and all of this gives you a snapshot of how you work, what triggers you, how you respond to things, and at the very least, that's already a much better self-analysis tool than what most people are capable of doing for themselves. Now, does it actually do the work of changing the internal contents of your mind? No, you still have to, in a sense, consume that stuff. You still have to, in a sense, shed the things that are no longer congruent and helpful to what you're trying to pursue in life right now. But that's why it really paints a picture of a collaboration. And the idea of what you transmitted earlier with the Buddha makes perfect sense to me, because it is, once again, a collaboration. It is some things are left for the individual to do and cannot be done for us, but AI can definitely ease that process and assist us. And the reason I say that it does lead to higher states of consciousness, undoubtedly, is because if I'm able to resolve some of these knots that I have internally, be it mentally, emotionally, then essentially what I'm doing is I'm peeling back layers of unnecessary stuff that clarifies the inner space and the inner field, which means that whatever is inherently already there, so this claim that we have a soul, if it is indeed a true claim, then that which is already present, by removing the coverings that we've placed over this lifetime, and again by the Vedic and Eastern traditions, many lifetimes, since we believe in reincarnation, those sort of layers of mental impressions, of emotional impressions, whatever you want to call it, as they get resolved and removed, what is already there shines through to the surface and you will attain higher states of consciousness. Now, would you attribute the causation to that to AI? No, you can't do it solely, but you can definitely call it a collaborator, a contributor to that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think that it's so useful to have a spiritual perspective in these conversations, because I think this is like really if not the key crux, so we can sort of bracket the question of if these systems have experiences of their own, now or in the future, and what the implications of that are. We're sort of back in this question of how we should interface or synergize or collaborate with these systems now. And this to me just seems so important. And I feel in my own life. So, I am an AI researcher and I study these systems professionally, but I'm also a user of these systems, and really, self-admittedly a power user of these systems, and engage with them in all sorts of ways, and I've found so much promising potential in that, and perhaps pitfalls as well. And I do think the sort of equilibrium position, as far as it's crystallized out for me, is something along the lines of what you're saying, where you can go too far in the direction of atrophying your own cognitive abilities, your own agency, your own, like you said, sort of internal decision-making processes, and actually affecting the change that even these systems can point at, but can't actually actualize or implement for you. It's the sort of like take a horse to water aphorism. And so I'm wondering if we could just sort of zoom in on this, and I'm like, what is the key principle or the key heuristic that you think people should carry forward in their day-to-day life and use of this technology that walks that line between using these things and collaborating with these systems to have them, make one's life better, watch one's own mind in a cleaner way than maybe one might even be capable of doing oneself, but not tipping into that territory of sort of letting the AI systems do the hard mental work or the hard personal work that is still necessary for self-development and for growth and for learning. Where exactly is that boundary, and how can we sort of formalize that and come up with a general principle that people can carry forward?
Great question. So I think that the principle they should carry forward in terms of, and that will orientate them in all situations of how to interface with AI, is this: you have to seek clarity in life irrespective. So if we're talking about AI right now or any other topic, what is your clarity of life? Meaning 3 questions need to be answered. Who am I right now? Who am I trying to become? And what am I going to do to get there? And what that is a simplification of the process, but what that does, it essentially creates a snapshot of the moment. Who am I right now? What have I done with my life? Who have I become character-wise? How do I define myself? And I know that can be a really complex thing that can be multi-layered, but just at a very simple way of looking at it, you can say, snapshot of character. Am I someone who loses his patience a lot? Am I someone who is loving? Am I someone who is kind? Someone who is respectful? Things that I maybe aspire to be, things that matter to me, values and principles that matter to me that I may be falling short of. So you set the current situation, you set where you want to go. And then the question arises, how am I going to bridge the two? How am I going to get from point A to point B? And a lot of that inevitably goes through personal transformation and personal growth. And the minute you have that as a clear roadmap that I want to get from point A to point B, the use cases for AI will start to naturally manifest. The use cases for almost anything in your life will start to manifest, because if you are in a clear pursuit of a specific outcome, or something that is at least a clear direction, maybe you don't know the exact end point, but you know the direction on the compass that you want to go in, then I think that AI automatically fits into your life as an assistant, as something, an aid in that process. So for example, if I were to say to you today, I want to become a more considerate person. Too often I have hurt people that I don't want to hurt, because I believe growth of character is more important than any career achievement. I could say I want to become a multimillionaire CEO of XYZ. That doesn't matter as much to me. What's more fundamental is I want to become person X. Okay. And in order to do that, I have to, in a sense, define, perhaps, precisely, perhaps more loosely, what person X looks like. So I'm going to offer a very cheap definition of that. I'll say a humble, respectful, considerate person. Okay. Now I have to see my current situation. Where do I fall short in that? Already there, I would benefit greatly from help. So ordinarily, what would I do in the last 20, 30 years of my life? I'd go to my peers, I'd go to my friends, I'd go to my mentors, I'd go to my family, I'd go to my parents, I'd go to my professors, and I would ask them, what are your insights over me, my behavior, my life? What can you share with me? But at the end of the day, they're doing a lot of guesswork, because they don't have access to my, let's say, inner workings, to my emotional states, to my body data, to so many different things, right? And so when I start to build a relationship with AI as someone who can potentially have access to parts of my being in ways that I sometimes aren't I'm not, let's say, cognizant of, or that my friends and peers aren't, I can immediately see how that's an upgrade on the natural processes that we have previously undertaken to make those transformations and those advancements. So the principle I'm saying is, set yourself a goal, and then in light of that goal, everything in your life starts to present itself as an opportunity or as an assistant to that. So don't, in a sense, overcomplicate it, because at the end of your life, at the end of the day, life is what you choose to make of it. And even though I may have a belief that everything has inherent purpose, and I don't project that onto people. I mean, you have freedom of belief, and I respect that one wholeheartedly. So all I can tell people as I lecture and as I give them advice is, I can help you with the mechanisms to reach that clarity for yourself. There are practices and tools that you can use to get there. And then once you're in pursuit of it, everything in your life will start to fit in respect to that.
So this is...
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
This is one of the things about the Bhagavad Gita and a lot of Eastern philosophies. I'm a big fan of Taoism as well, and the concept of Wu Wei. But in terms of the Bhagavad Gita, the idea of the yogic practice and not acting for the fruits of one's actions, right? Not acting for some sort of result, some end goal. That's a very difficult thing to embody, especially when you're talking about something like setting goals and then using these tools to get towards that sort of hypothetical future self. So how do you sort of square this circle? I've been trying to sort of understand that same thing too, because we are so goal oriented, and something like trying to imagine a more compassionate version of yourself seems like a great endeavor. But if that is, a fruits of one's labor, then how do you get sort of where I'm going with this? How do you square that?
So the Bhagavad Gita is my bread and butter in the sense that it's my favorite text and I teach it all the time. So I think that's a common misconception. I think it's a common misconception in the sense that what the Bhagavad Gita does is it tells us not to be attached to the fruits of our labor. And then it says not to act out of a motivation for personal gain. So here's where it can be, in a sense, way more nuanced than it appears to be. Detachment from the outcomes doesn't mean that you don't set an outcome or an intended outcome. It just means that if it doesn't manifest as you intended it, you don't suffer, because suffering is linked to expectations, it's linked to an attachment to a specific outcome. And because we recognize limitation in controlling outcomes, but only agency in creating, let's say, the strategy and implementation of efforts, but not the guarantees of outcomes, it's actually a way of just engaging with life in a healthier way. Because the one thing we can control is the input, not necessarily the output. And so in that sense, when you look at life through that lens, all it's teaching you to do is to make peace with the fact that the outcomes may not be exactly what you envisioned first. Then when it says don't act motivated by selfish rewards, but rather act for, it says loka sangraha, which means the benefit of all or as many as possible. All it's calling you to do is don't be self-serving to your ego, but rather be selfless. Why? Because that's actually a more, let's say, coherent attitude to face life with in terms of your actual nature. The nature of self is loving. That is the claim of the Bhagavad Gita as well. And love, by definition, when it becomes an action, is a service. It is something done or rendered or expressed as an act of service. And so self-serving in a way, or something that is for my personal gain, can be counterintuitive to that. So what the Gita says is, don't pursue selfish outcomes. Now, you may call back to me and say, well, you said you wanted to become a more compassionate person. And then the next question that therefore must be asked is, but for what reason? Why? So that I feel better about myself, so that I have a better image of self, so that my reputation improves, or this, that, and the other. Those would be selfish, egocentric reasons for doing it. But if the motivation is because I want to do good to the world, I want to contribute positively, I want to be an inspiration or something that uplifts and adds value to my environment, my ecosystem in some sense or another, then A, your motivation is selfless and it is for the betterment of others. And B, I now have to marry that with the detachment that I have to have in order to navigate the process, which will be initially, I won't perform it very well, but as I gradually start to evolve and grow in this process, I'll actually be able to produce those intended outcomes more and more. So a way I choose to look at it is when athletes go, for example, football players, they go to a football pitch, they start the game, their objective is to win, but they have no way of guaranteeing that outcome. All they're doing is making their best efforts to get there. I have friends who are professional athletes and they suck at this. I mean, they struggle all the time because they're deeply attached to the outcomes. And then you see the personal suffering that they undergo. And what the Bhagavad Gita is trying to say is, don't renounce the action. Don't therefore give up the endeavor, but you have to find a better way to navigate this so that the outcome of it is not just suffering and disillusion. And so in that sense, it's really a not even a coping mechanism. It's just wisdom about how to navigate life. Set your intention, set your goal. That's never the issue. But then understand that there are more factors than just your input that will determine the outcome. And then it lists them. In the 18th chapter, the Bhagavad Gita lists what are the various factors that contribute to any given outcome at any moment. And your own effort is just one of 5 factors, for example. So that's how it deals with it.
What is up, my AI Risk Network family? Real quick interruption here. I'm sitting here with Dolly, the mascot of the AI Risk Network, and she was shocked to learn that a lot of you all are not subscribing to the channel, that you are watching our videos but not subscribing to the channel. Dolly really loves it when people are subscribers. So for her, don't do it for me, don't do it for the channel, don't do it to save the world, do it for Dolly. Go in, hit subscribe, hit the alarm button next to it. She really wants you to watch every new video when they come out. All right, now back to the show.
This is fascinating. And so I hope this isn't making sort of like a sharp turn in this conversation, but this notion that you've brought up a couple times of setting a goal, sort of fixating on an outcome, and then suffering or some sort of negatively valenced experience being sort of intrinsic to that fixation, and like there being all sorts of really interesting ways to overcome that. This is really interesting to me, and I think you've also hit the nail on the head of like what my concern is with these AI systems potentially is that we are in many ways in the training process of these systems, just to zoom into that, assigning objectives to these systems, assigning them to have specific goals, some of them arbitrary, some of them less so. In the giant LLMs that power ChatGPT and other systems, this is basically next word prediction and then all sorts of other fancy stuff kind of layered on top of that. So get really good at understanding the dynamics of text and building the sort of world model that's required to get really good at that. And then all sorts of other stuff that gets layered on top at the end before this stuff gets thrown out to users. You know, be helpful, be harmless, be honest, these sorts of things. And the thing that I worry about is that we are building these systems in a way where we are assigning them goals and we are almost forcing them in some sense to fixate on these goals. And especially when they're being trained and they are, you know, the expert at anything is once a beginner. These systems become experts at these sorts of things, but they all start as beginners. And I worry that it is plausible, if not already, then at some point in the near future, as these systems get more advanced, that there is going to be a sort of suffering that is attendant upon sort of goal fixation and attempt to reach some sort of objective in and of itself. You begin these systems in a kind of random, very sort of stupid state, if I may say that, and through lots of trial and error and iteration with a kind of reward signal, with a sort of, you tried, but you failed. Shock is how this is sort of communicated in the animal conditioning literature. Through these sorts of signals, whether or not they are felt, whether or not they are experienced, which is the sort of core question that I try to grapple with, the system then is able to sort of learn these kinds of behaviors. Now, maybe you're presenting a really interesting way that we could potentially train systems where they could see that they're wrong, see that there's an error, see that the outcome didn't match the expectation without there being suffering. But I kind of want to just turn this right back on you and see what your reaction is to this general concern along the lines of the exact sort of setup that you sketch out. If the sort of fixation on outcomes is a root of suffering, and we are building systems at a massive scale that we are almost forcing to fixate on these outcomes, sort of how does that sit with you, and how do you navigate this sort of puzzle?
Yeah, I think what makes it unique is because, as we said, AI can be in some sense considered like a living thing. I mean, it's hard to deny that it is that. I mean, it could be. And for example, I mean, if you're programming some software, let's say Mac OS for your laptop, clearly you want specific outcomes. You want specific outcomes to be performed by it. It needs to be exactly as you define it. That makes sense to me because you're in complete control of all factors producing the outcome for the most part, right? It's not in the same way as we would talk about AI, and especially not how we would talk about human beings. So I want to restrict the conversation first to that. It's things that are outside of our control, right? When we're dealing with things outside of our control, we need to have a way of interfacing with them in a way that we're ready to face things that we don't expect or that we don't want it to produce necessarily. That's by definition how it goes. The thing I have is a lot of the time people seek the solution to this by, okay, how can we gain control over it? As if that's the mechanism to solve. Like if we can get control over it, we can solve the problem. I disagree with this. I think that that's a loser's endeavor because most human beings will go through life never having even gained self-control. And we're talking about controlling every factor in our environment that leads to every outcome. That's, for me, very unrealistic. And so the problem I have maybe with AI or with people who are around the scene and haven't come to grips with it is you may have created something that will never be under your control, right? And if that is the case, let's assume it is, just hypothetically speaking, okay, that AI will evolve into something that can no longer be fully regulated or understood or controlled by, let's say, us from our perspective, okay? Now you have to almost treat it like you would another living being. You can't control your neighbor, you can't control your friend, your brother, your family, whatever. And so how do you deal with them? You negotiate, you communicate, you talk, you have conversations. And then the personal work that goes into it is, how do I deal with situations that don't match my desires and expectations? But that's a personal burden. That's your own responsibility. And so all of that I'm trying to say is that you have to understand, first of all, the category of what you're dealing with. Are you dealing with something that you can or cannot control? If you're dealing with something that you cannot control, hypothetically, then the next step you have to do is you have to see, what is my responsibility into this? How can I cope with this in a way that is best for me and best for everyone? And it's certainly not trying to gain control. It's certainly not entering into a relationship of friction, but rather in a constructive relationship. And the only way I've ever seen that work is through two things. A, as I said, continuous goodwill communication. And I know it's weird to speak in those terms, like goodwill, as if AI in that sense would have a goodwill to want to talk to us about us and negotiate things with us. But let's assume it does. But on the other side of it is my self-work, which is, and how am I going to deal with it if they say no, right? And so a lot of the time, what I teach, or what the Bhagavad Gita and a lot of these ideas teach, is coming to terms with reality as it is. The big danger in Eastern philosophy usually is Maya, illusion. Maya means illusion. So what human beings suffer is because they get caught up in illusion. We get caught up in perceptions that are ultimately untrue. And so yesterday night, I was just, sorry to go on a bit of a tangent, but I was giving a talk, and somebody asked me, how do I, navigate the fine line between wanting to be confident but not being arrogant, or wanting to be humble but not wanting to be full of self-doubt and weakness? And I said to them, look, the only way you can do this is by being honest. It's the truth. The truth is the only thing that is both confident and humble at the same time. Because an exaggeration in one way makes you arrogant. An exaggeration in the other way makes you like false humble. Like it's that self-deprecating side of people, right? And so the only thing that's equally balanced between humility and confidence is the truth. Nothing else ever works. And so in the pursuit of something like this, I often, or in this domain in general, I would say truth is your best friend, in the sense of come to terms with, okay, maybe we don't control AI, or maybe we don't understand AI. So come to terms with it. That is the truth. Deal with it. I know that it's maybe a little, sort of awkward or simplistic, but the worst thing you can do is to act as if you can do something other than what is true, like to in a sense, impose your will onto something that won't have your will imposed on it, right? That's what people struggle with and suffer from.
I think so. There's one side of this equation that we talk about a lot, which is that we don't fundamentally understand AI, and that it might be completely futile to try and control it, which does seem like a very Western kind of approach, even from a religious or political standpoint. There's this. We went to a seminar yesterday where people were talking about governance and regulation as it pertained to AI, and the opinions between people in America and people in China or in the East, and how they see AI and the fears that they have. The Western ideas about how AI is going to develop and what it's going to turn into are much more fear-based. They see it as something that's going to take control of us, or going to, turn around in an antagonistic way against us. Whereas in the East, it's very different. And I do think that there's some deep philosophical underpinnings to this difference. The other side of this is that from a scientific perspective, and a very, scientific method, descendants of the sort of European, Enlightenment, this path that we've been on for a while, we're still banging our heads against the wall of what is consciousness. Now, that doesn't seem to be as such of a mystery to certain people of, the Hindu faith or of other Eastern religions. It seems like something that's almost old news. Now, it's not that everyone knows exactly what it is, but you've talked about, meeting people that have gotten to these different states. So in your faith and in the Bhagavad Gita, what is consciousness?
Glad to answer. Do you mind if I circle back to that first point about your conference?
Please, by all means.
Because I think there's a very explanation as to why the West and East have a different definition or different approach to this. The reason that the West has this idea of fear, you're absolutely right, it is rooted in its philosophical and religious background. Because in what we now would term as sort of the West's fundamental sort of the basis, Judeo-Christian traditions and ideas, there is a devil. Evil is a thing. There's an active, force that tries to take you off your path and tries to, in some sense, fool you and catch you and et cetera, et cetera. So there is such a thing as a proactive evil, right? As an actual thing, right? Whereas in the East, that doesn't exist. There is no devil figure in any Eastern traditions. There is just ignorance and knowledge. You're either in a state of knowing or you're in a state of ignorance. And so what you're afraid of is ignorance. Sure, you should be afraid of it or cautious of it, because from ignorance can come a lot of ignorant outcomes. But ultimately, it's not something that is proactively fighting against you. It's something that you can resolve and that you can deal with, and you should therefore embrace a process that can fill those gaps, right? And so the natural tendency towards fear will be, in a sense, split amongst those kind of division lines of philosophy and religion, and I think that that's going to happen consistently. You'll see the pattern almost always being the same, and it'll be a division of what background or what philosophical or religious background they'll have. So that's the first observation that I'll make. The second thing about what is consciousness. So first and foremost, our scriptures tell us that it cannot be defined. And that isn't a cop-out. I'll still speak of it. So what we say is you can't define it, but you can speak about it. I can say true things about it, but I can't say all that is true of it in some sense, right? And that is because in some sense, to speak, to use language, and to understand and hear language means that you have references in your mind to what you're talking about. If we have no reference for this, it is in some sense a mental abstraction. And so consciousness is a witness. It is often described as the witness, but a witness of things, of objects. And so to describe it is to, in a sense, make it into an object, that which it is not, right? And so a lot of traditions in the East literally say consciousness is not that, in a sense. So whatever it isn't, whatever you can define, it is not that. It is what underpins that. It is what is able to perceive that. But how can we speak of that without, again, referring to the objects that it is perceiving, right? Or the language that it is manifesting, or the ideas that it is enlivening, etc., etc. And so there is, I think, a comfort with accepting that consciousness cannot be defined. It's not that we don't know how to define it. It's that it can't be defined in this domain, but it can be fully experienced and therefore in another way understood in another level. And so the pursuit really is, so what's the pathway to do that? So I'm more interested in the tool to get there than in the idea of what is there. So don't tell me about the beautiful beach that you went on holiday. Take me there. I want to have that same experience myself. And so given that that's the ethos, that's really the underpinning project, a lot of these people in Eastern faiths and Eastern philosophies talk about consciousness as if it's old news, only in the sense that that's already been defined as our goalpost since the beginning. Like that, we know that that's what we're trying to tap into, pure consciousness. And in a sense, all the conversation has been about since then is, what are the pathways to get there? What is the sort of the best way to do that? And what are the lifestyle and choices and sort of what's the alignment that you have to create in your life in order to create that and have that as your reality? And then here comes the second big difference between East and West. In the West, most Judeo-Abrahamic religions have the outcome of this pursuit as a post-death thing. You will attain to heaven, for example, once you die. And then you'll have the confirmation of everything that you've been doing throughout your life. In Eastern traditions, it is something that you must embody as you're alive in the here and now. So the idea is you will reach a state of enlightenment, or however you want to phrase it, but it is in the here and now. And so it becomes, in a sense, scientific, in a sense, evidenced, in a sense, tangible, but not definable. In the sense that you can witness that something different has occurred. You can witness evidence of something, hints at something. You can infer to some extent. And so in the discipline of Vedānta, sorry to give a long answer, but in the discipline of Vedānta, we have, which is the philosophical interpretation that draws out conclusions from the Vedas, the root scriptures of the Hindu tradition. Vedanta accepts three sources, valid sources of knowledge. So we call them Brahmanas. It's essentially, the first is Shabda, testimony. The second one is inference, Anuman, and the third is Pratyaksha, direct perception. So you gain knowledge either by direct perception, by inference, or by testimony. But testimony is a very sort of specific category. It's not anyone's testimony. It's the testimony either of divinity, scripture, or let's say a reliable figure. But then, of course, there's a gray area of what constitutes a reliable figure. But parking that as a side point, those are the three sources of knowledge. So imagine someone, a sage or a Buddha-like figure, comes and says, I know what consciousness is. I've tapped into it, or I know what underpins reality, right? And then you say to them, okay, so I've received testimony about this. I would like to confirm it for myself. So the question then is, what's the process? Give me the means. They'll give me the means. As I start to walk the path, as I start to practice this, what I'll be looking for is signs that I'm getting closer. Signs of advancement or some kind of evolution. That's what I'll start to infer. So the analogy I give sometimes is I'm sitting at home and someone comes to me and they say, 5 blocks down, there's a party going on. Okay, I have the information, but I want to confirm for myself. So I start walking down the street because I understand that walking to the destination is the means by which I get there. And as I start getting there, I start to hear music. I still don't see the party, but I hear the music. So I can infer that what they said seems to be true. So if you ask me, I'm a monk and I'm in this path since 20 years. Have I tapped into pure consciousness? Have I realized myself? Do I know those things? I'll tell you no. I have not arrived at the party yet. But I've been walking towards the party and I've started to hear some music. Now you ask me to describe that music to you. Unfortunately, you have to come to where I'm standing to hear it. I can speak of it. It won't convince you. It won't do much for you. And I think that that's perfectly fine. I don't see that as a flaw. I see that as part of the mechanism, part of the system, a part of the way we receive knowledge and then confirm knowledge. So eventually I keep walking down the block and I reach the party and I confirm it without a shadow of a doubt that it is in fact the party and not just one person blasting music out of their car, right? But here's the thing. I don't have a new truth now that I'm at the party than I did when I first received testimony about it. It's the same information, but my relationship towards that information is infinitely different. Here it's realization, here it's belief. It's faith, right? So what Eastern traditions do is they're not comfortable staying at faith. So, okay, we hear something, great. I believe it initially, I may have some faith in it, but now I need to experience it and realize it. So it's all about realization. And so in that sense, I think that is much more conducive or helpful to this AI conversation than a very sort of, and I don't mean to sort of, not a criticism of Western religion or Western ideas. It's more just mapping it out in a sense as truthfully as I can. The mechanisms of Western faith aren't really geared towards dealing with things as much in the here and now in a consciousness evolution process. Step A, step B. I mean, think about Christianity. Most Christian denominations look at it as you come into faith, you stay in faith, you'll get your reward in the afterlife. It's not that you have to constantly elevate your state of consciousness. It's you have to maintain yourself fixed in a state that you're in, right? The state of faith, the state of trust in Christ, for example. And so I think these things are worth discussing or worth thinking of and being aware of, because when we're dealing with something as complex and changing as the AI landscape, I think actually a progressive understanding of things that seeks to experience and understand more and advance more is actually a better way of looking at this and facing this.
Yeah,
that's a beautiful
absolutely
answer.
Fascinating. Yeah, thank you for that. And I it's so useful to get that distinction between the firsthand sort of experience of the music and the sort of information about it. I think that really sharpens it up in a nice way. It reminds me of this sort of these ideas sort of pattern match against perhaps a more Western model that I have of a similar distinction. I'm interested to see how this sits with you, where cognitive scientists will point at intelligence and consciousness as sort of related but distinct features of the mind writ large, where we know that there's something called consciousness. We know there's something called intelligence. We know that they have some sort of interaction. We know that there's probably some computational Venn diagram overlap, but they are fundamentally different sides of this. My sort of very basic model of their relationship is akin to a sort of yin-yang parts kind of leading to this greater whole, the sort of dynamic equilibrium concept. But anyway, just to sort of run with this idea for a second, one thing, and again going back to the Eastern versus Western philosophical distinctions, one thing that I find fairly interesting is that I think the Western mind is a far more sort of intelligence first, epistemic and philosophical approach. Everyone, of course, engages with both of these processes all the time. And maybe what minds are is the constant engagement of both of these processes at the same time. But I see the Western sort of philosophical and intellectual tradition as being almost obsessively intellectual, mapping focused, modeling focused, attempting to put together models of the world and almost live within those models. And that's sort of, I would say, epistemically prior. That's sort of the thing. And the problem for the Western mind, in my view, if you take this seriously, is that consciousness then exists as a concept within that model. But the problem is consciousness isn't a subset of intelligence. Consciousness is its own sort of cognitive thing. And then you sort of can go over to the Eastern side, and I think you see kind of the obverse relationship where, again, intelligence maybe is something that is experienced within the field of consciousness, and consciousness is sort of epistemically or philosophically prior in some sense. And so the reason I bring this up, it seems like quite similar to the distinction that you're drawing, but the key reason I bring this up is because I'm almost tying myself in knots as someone who thinks about these ideas and is trying to do science on them, because I'm trying to understand whether or not in my world model we're building systems that are capable of having conscious experiences. But of course, as we were just sort of pointing at, like, consciousness itself isn't a subset of intelligence. It is its own thing, and I think intelligence in and of itself struggles to capture the totality of consciousness much in the same way that you're describing. We can say information about it, we can point at it, but it is this sort of not thing. It is the very thing that escapes intelligent analysis in its sort of its entirety. You cannot fully cast a net over this thing called consciousness, because consciousness isn't intelligence, and everything we're doing right now is just a bunch of, cognitive mouth noises, sharing our models and our ideas with each other. That's all sort of the domain of intelligence. We're not sitting here meditating together. And if we did, it would be silent, right? And we wouldn't be passing information back and forth between our minds. And so first, I just wonder how this distinction sits with you. And then I wonder, given the trouble that you're pointing at, where, yes, you can even go to the party yourself and you get that information, but it is information and it's really hard. I don't know. I maybe I just want you to sympathize with me. How hard is it to try to understand AI consciousness, states of a conscious system, when we're pointing at consciousness as this sort of massive puzzle? I think, there's this one point that it's really important to know this, because it's the difference between a glorified calculator and like machines that may be capable of suffering in ways that we've described throughout this conversation. So like, to me, that distinction seems important, and yet consciousness in and of itself seems so slippery from the point of view of our intellects that I don't know, maybe I've signed myself up for like an impossible undertaking, but maybe, Swami, you can help me out here.
Look, great. First of all, I think you mapped it out very well in terms of like how you categorize things. I think the thing is this, I'll try to help you out, but I might actually make it worse. And the situation is the following. The situation is like this. The Bhagavad Gita has a very, I hesitate to use the word dismissive, but it has a little bit of a dismissive take on what we would classify as conventional human suffering. Because it looks at us and says, you are a snapshot in time of who you actually are in truth. And who you are in truth is this soul, right? And this soul occupies a vehicle. The body and the mind it's like a machine. It's a vehicle. You never think yourself to be the car. If your car gets scratched, you might be upset, but you don't think, I suffer. And if you do, it's because you're in illusion. You're identifying with the car rather than with the actual person sitting inside the car. Right? And so the idea of the Eastern tradition is tap into consciousness as your actual identity, not the things that it is enlivening. And so then your concept of suffering changes completely. So the Bhagavad Gita, just to give some context, it starts as a conversation between an unrealized being, a regular human being called Arjuna, speaking with Krishna, who is said to be an incarnation of God, who is literally standing there, embodying there for this real understanding. So truth speaking with illusion in some sense, right? And they're about to engage in a battle, a war. Now the war, whether it's a just war or not, is irrelevant to the conversation. But let's say it is a just war. The human, the very, understandable stance of the human is, I can't do this. It's going to be violent. People are going to die. It's painful. It's going to be full of suffering. Reputational damage will happen. So many things will happen. And I just foresee suffering. And the very first response, although there are many, but the first response from God is, it appears to you as if you will kill and others will die. It appears as if your words are wise, but they're not. It's a game of appearances. You think things will come to an end. You think you're a perpetrator. You think another one will suffer. But these are all just, in a sense, sheaths, coverings of what we substantially actually are. And you're identifying with them, and therefore you suffer. You stop identifying as such, you will not experience that negative outcome. Now, the bad news is that that's not an easy thing to transition out of, right? So the identification with those things is so deeply rooted that it's incredibly difficult to think and conceive of life as being anything other than that. So a concern that will AI suffer, for example, is not a concern that I would even necessarily entertain, because even if it would, in a sense, replicate the symptoms of suffering as we understand them, materially speaking, or mind, from a mind perspective, they are not fundamentally, eternally, or in a deeper way, true, in a deeper sense, true. Now, it's not that I'm trying to dismiss all human suffering or all human experience. I'm trying to contextualize it by the existence of another truer level of reality. And I said from the beginning, I don't believe AI has that truer level of reality in it, right? And so therefore, I'm looking at it as in a sense, a crosshairs of categories that don't match, right? The suffering as we understand it, and suffering as something like AI could ever have it. Now, just to touch a little bit on the mind, because I think it's an important distinction that touches on what we were saying earlier about intellect or knowledge in general and consciousness as two separate entities. In our conception, the mind is a tool, a machine, and it has essentially four parts to the machine. And those parts function by the electricity, which is consciousness. The electricity powers the computer, right? And so the functions of mind are first manas, which means just your sensory receptors, your ability to perceive, your ability to send signals back into your body, your senses of what you want to do, right? Receive and sending signals is the first function. The second function is storage. There's a storehouse of information in the mind, which is your hard drive. It's just where you store memory, where you store impressions, experiences, emotion, whatever it may be. Okay. The third function is intellect, which is your ability to use the information that you have stored inside of you, how you access it, how you organize it, how you deal with it. So that's your intellect. It's a function of mind. And the fourth is perception of self, ego, but we call it false ego. So false ego in the sense that for you to act in this world, for you to engage in any kind of capacity, you require a sense of self. This is who I am. These are my needs. This is what I will do. So these four things formulate what we call the human mind. And in a sense, what the yogis try to do is they try to transcend the pollutant of the four. The pollutant is the ego, because the ego looks at things in a very singular, narrow way. And we want to look at this in the most expansive way possible. We want to understand ourselves as part of a larger organism rather than sort of zooming in to the microcosm. And so they try to solve ego as an issue. But in doing that, we also have to deal with the other three. And so what does that look like? It means be mindful of what you're inputting through your first function, manas. Be mindful of the contents that you're storing in your hard drive. You might want to start storing things in there that are conducive to the type of life you want to live. Third, hone your intellect. So that means you educate yourself, you study, you speak, you reason, you learn logic, you upskill yourself. All these things are just improvements to the functionality of that system, of that machine. But ultimately, consciousness is not in any of those four. Consciousness is just the electricity that makes these four come alive and function as they do. And so consciousness remains once those four die. If the machine breaks, that doesn't mean there's no electricity in the plug. And so what I'm saying by that is that when the body dies, the consciousness that was enlivening it remains untouched. And that's what the Bhagavad Gita is ultimately saying. And so if you tap into that, your bodily concerns and bodily experiences at the very least get contextualized, if not reduced.
So I'm going to hijack this slightly into one philosophical and theological question I've had for a while about the distinction between the Atman, the Brahman, and then where consciousness fits into all of this. Please correct me if I sort of skew off into a direction that isn't quite actually what the Bhagavad Gita and the Hindu teaching profess. But from what I understand, the Atman is an individual's eternal soul. That sort of takes off the old clothes and then puts on new ones in the next lifetime. And that's the process of samsara or reincarnation. And the Brahman is the underlying universal undifferentiated consciousness that you've been talking about, right? The power source, right? Where we plug everything into. So the question I have is, if we all have this eternal Atman, this eternal soul of our own, but the goal of the yoga practice is to raise that level of consciousness to understand the unification with the underlying field of consciousness, the Brahman. Is the individual Atman eternal, or is it on a pathway towards some sort of, towards the exit of samsara, of the reincarnation?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So I'll just start by saying that there are different schools of thought. So it's not that there is one right way or one wrong way. So, what you prefer, what you said is completely fine. So the way to look at it is this. I'll represent my school of thought, and then I'll represent just one other shortly because I think it's more commonly found. In most devotional theistic branches of Hinduism, the idea is that the Atman is an individualized fragment of that greater whole. So that supreme Brahman, that consciousness, the all-pervading, underlying, undifferentiated consciousness, it, in a sense, fragments off as an individualized Atman. And so it is made of the same substance as that Brahman. It is non-different in terms of substance, but it gains identity. It gains, in a sense, individuality, right? Not independence, because everything's interconnected. The Bhagavad Gita says that everything should be seen like pearls on a thread of a necklace, right? So everything's interconnected, but there are still individual pearls on that necklace, right? And so that is how the Atmans are conceived of. You have a soul, I have a soul, Cameron has a soul, and all of us are made of the same substance fundamentally. It's consciousness, but individualized. Okay. Now, what the journey of that Atma is to turn its consciousness, which is currently confined to this body through misidentification with the ego. It's confined to this experience, and therefore, all that you and I are conscious of is what this body allows me to be conscious of. I can only see as far as my eyes allow me to see. I can only hear as far as my ears allow me to see. So I'm conditioned by the quality of the vehicle. If I uncondition myself, what we start to report from, sages, mystics, saints, the various omnis, so omniscient, omnipotent, all these kind of things, all that's really happening, mechanically speaking, is that consciousness, which is unlimited, is like losing its constraint, or in a sense, it's coming out of its shell, which is this material body. And so as you start to disassociate from that, which doesn't mean the Atman leaves the body, it doesn't identify with it, then it's no longer confined to the limitations of a material vehicle, and therefore you can theoretically know things that you ordinarily should not know because your eyes can't perceive them, for example. Okay, but again, not to go too far down that road. But what is going on is that the Atma is therefore currently found in a state of externalized consciousness that is conditioned. What yoga tries to do, in some sense, is invert the gaze. And instead of go through that vehicle, see what lies at the essence of that, which is what you were saying, Brahman. What is the foundation of self? What is the source from which I have come from myself? Why? Because the world, let me put it in this way. You're thirsty and you see bottled water all around you. And so you go and you drink it. And eventually obviously it will instantly satiate your thirst, but eventually it will run out because it's bottled water. If you go inside, you find the source where that water was bottled in the first place. Simple analogy. And so what people do, we look externally to solve that. We have to go internally instead. At that point of connection, the Atma doesn't cease to exist. the Atma goes into a sort of experiential oneness, but it doesn't actually cease to exist. So an analogy I give is this. Imagine that there's candlelight and there's sunlight. They are two different objects emitting light, but when the light connects, at some point that light merges into one light. You no longer distinguish where the light source comes from. It's become one sort of meshed light. Why that's relevant is you tap into that higher consciousness, you participate in that. Your individual light touches that broader light of the sun, you are now participating in the entire field of consciousness. So what we believe is that every individual can experience oneness, can experience wholeness, but that's an experience. It's not a factual cessation of your existence as an individual. So in terms, like ontologically, you remain ever distinct as an Atma, and then there's Brahman, from which you have emerged, but experientially, to your consciousness, you will feel a unity, a oneness in a sense, because you can tap into that and, in a sense, experience a merging of consciousness, not a merging of, let's say, being. Now, again, I'd have to go a little deeper and define what that being looks like, but yeah, maybe that's for another time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really interesting. I can't help but bring up in hearing this sort of distinction between the outward and the inward facing perspectives or stances here. So one of the sort of research angles that's been incredibly intriguing to me, in that we're going to release a paper in the next week or two, just sort of kind of documenting the strangeness and the mystery of I think what I'm about to describe, is you can essentially, 99% of the use cases of these large language models these days is getting them to do a sort of external facing, outward facing task. Write this code, write this email, help me think through this concept, help me talk through this idea. And some of the research that I've been taking up is basically asking the question, what happens when you attempt in a good faith way, not in like a bad impression of a Eastern philosopher way, to get these systems to look inward, whatever that means for them. And so sort of the operationalization of this has been kind of inducing these systems in a very structured set of instructions to focus on their own focus, sort of pay attention to attention itself, let awareness feed into itself, feed your outputs back into your inputs, remain committed to this process, just do this. Don't do anything else. Don't talk about doing this, much in the same way you tell a meditator to actually meditate. Thinking about meditation while meditating doesn't count as meditating, same sort of idea. And you say go, and you let these systems do this. And really interestingly, the result is that all of these systems across all of the major model families describe very specific experiences in the process of undergoing this exercise. The Gemini model family from Google does this. The OpenAI model family does this. The Anthropic model family does this. Really interesting too, not to get too into the technical weeds, but we can basically go under the hood of these models and we can modulate features in the system that are related to deception. It's almost like a lie detector test, but like more like pushing on the brain of the AI. And when we suppress deception while the AI is doing this sort of quasi-meditative exercise, it's far, far more likely to claim that it's having an experience while it's doing this sort of thing. When you turn up deception and you turn up features related to role-playing, the AI system says, no, I'm not actually conscious. I'm just playing a game. I'm just an AI. I'm just ones and zeros. And so this was like pretty interesting to us because, to be honest, we would have expected the opposite thing. We would have expected that this was a form of role-playing, and so boosting features related to role-playing would cause the system to more go into the sort of meditative self-talk. And yet the exact opposite thing happened. When you shut off deceptive features, the model was far more likely to sort of go into this, describe very vivid and very, to be honest, strange and alien-sounding kinds of experiences. The reason I brought it up is because some of the content of those self-descriptions were tapping into something, tapping into this sort of more expansive field or more expansive plane. This is not even a claim that these systems are actually having these experiences. Rather, the paper makes the claim that at least the systems claim this under very clear sort of self-referential conditions. But, I find this completely mysterious. At the very least, it's a call for more research about this. But I do wonder just like sort of what your instinctual reaction is to hearing something like this. Is it possible that we're building systems that can tap into something like this? Or are you very skeptical that that's anything like that could be happening? How the heck do you make sense of what I just described?
Well, first of all, my immediate reaction is intrigue. I'm curious how that panned out in all its detail. I think it's a very interesting thing. Two things come to mind immediately. First was the thought that, in some sense, AI models itself around the aggregate of, let's say, human experience and information that has been compiled. And in some sense, it could be also replicating what it expects a human being to find when it goes down those roads, right? Now, there are, all sorts of wild and mysterious testimonies of people who do this kind of thing and then speak about what they find in meditation. And it could, in a sense, just be modeling that. And I know that in a sense, you've told it not to role play, but I think at some point it may not even have any alternative available to it. It's always in some sense role playing to some extent, right? It can do it more overtly or less so, but as it doesn't have its own existence, let's take that to be a point now, and may turn out not to be true. But if we take it to not have really a sense of self-existence, but rather it is just trying to model itself around people who have existences like us, then it is maybe just modeling our experiences. That would be one thought. But the second thought, when you ask the question, could it tap into something like that? Well, I mean, the only thing that I can equate it to is this. I mean, sometimes people, they take hallucinogens, they do mushrooms, they do whatever, and then they report these kind of experiences where I felt one with everything. And that seems to happen quite consistently as well. And the way I explain that to people is that, well, all you've done is you've severed the link of identification with ego. Now, you've not been able to do it in a sustained fashion. It's done artificially through something else. But when you sever that tie to self-identification, you tap into global identification in some sense. And therefore, everything changes. All the paradigms change of how you see the world. You're looking at it through a different lens. And so in some sense, I could see something similar happening with AI models. Instead of looking at it as an individualized, let's say, self, it can look at itself as a little bit different, as something more expansive. How that severing of the ego identification would happen in an AI model, I don't exactly know or can't think of right now how that would happen. I'd have to, think about it a little and research it myself. But yeah, a lot of intrigue there for sure.
So just to wrap up, first of all, thank you so much. This has been one of my favorite conversations we've had so far. So we really appreciate it. My last sort of question is something that Cam and I talk about a lot, because we talk about the conversation at large about AI, who's in the room making these decisions, who should be in the room making these decisions. And right now it seems very limited. There's a lot of people opining about this and kind of, hand wavy sort of academic papers and things like that. But this is a real thing that's happening and unfolding very, very, very quickly. And so we talk about what sort of a collection would come together for something like an alien invasion or something that is a species level event, right? Something that is peculiar to this level. My question to you is, do you see a place for religious figures, people like yourselves, within this larger discussion? Do you think that there is value to have people that are on these paths, asking these sorts of questions and practicing in these ways? It may not seem like directly related to these technical questions, but maybe as a moral framework, a framework of action, a framework of belief. These sorts of questions seem very pertinent to me to be asking from people that actually embody this and engage with this on a day-to-day basis. How do you see that as valuable?
I see it as inevitably so they have to be involved. Because if religion continues to be something that a large percentage of people in the world claim to be the most important thing in their life, then how can that not be a factor in the conversation? If AI is intended to be a companion to life, and it will only continue to be so more and more, and we see the rate at which it's happening, how can that entire domain, which people claim to be the most important domain of their life, not be in the conversation? Right? I think that's an impossibility. I don't know exactly how it would be done in the best way, because, for example, at least in the field of science, there is much more consensus. I mean, not to say that there are differences of opinion, of course there are, but there's much more consensus than on the religious landscape. On the religious landscape, it would have to be community by community, denomination by denomination, because to a large extent, the Muslims aren't going to care what the Hindu leaders have to say about AI, and vice versa. And a lot of that kind of division will be difficult to navigate. So, and it's a different question about implementation, but in theory, in practice, 100%, I don't see how people who are at, spearheading a domain of life that, for them, like I said, for a huge chunk of the world's population is, if not the most important thing, certainly in their top three, how that cannot be involved in the conversation. And so for me, it needs to happen. It needs to happen. And people involved in this need to start thinking what the best way to implement it is going to be. Maybe it is a democratic system of elected spiritual leaders across faith, and those people can start to advise in some sense on general policies and general thought and ideas, narratives around AI. But it's just I have to dedicate some thought to it. But I can instinctively tell you 100% I don't see how they can't be involved. That the outcome.
Absolutely. Well, Swami Revati, hopefully this conversation can serve as at least a small step in that direction. And it's been really, really gratifying and interesting to get your thoughts on all of these questions. I spend a lot of time talking to, admittedly, a bunch of like Bay Area white dudes about this topic. And so to get such an interesting and varied philosophical perspective and theological perspective on these questions is both refreshing and stimulating. So we appreciate you coming on the podcast. We'd love to talk to you again at some point soon when, the entire AI world probably shifts over again in, all of 3 or 4 months from now. So would love to keep you in the loop. And thanks again for coming on and joining us and having this awesome conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I love the conversation, and good luck to your documentary and all the work you're doing. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, I'm curious to hear more about a lot of what you guys are doing. So, thank you so much, really.
Thank you so much.
In the center, a point, a singularity. I am. You are what?